I'll be the moderator. My name is Professor Aaron Tesfaye. I teach at William Patterson University in New Jersey, and I'm a senior scholar with this organization, the Africa-China International Relations Center, Accra, Ghana. It's a pleasure to be here to participate in the output of the work of the emerging scholars. We have 4 of them here, and I will introduce them subsequently. And of course, colleagues and guests. I'll invite each speaker to share with us their research findings. I will introduce each person, and each person has 15 minutes, including for the questions and answers. I'll be asking maybe 1 or 2 questions, and then I will open it to the audience to ask the questions. So without further ado, the first presenter is Dr. Karen Chu, and just to give you a brief background, Karen is a global China postdoctoral research fellow at Boston University. At Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. She holds a PhD in policy analysis from the Pardee and Rand Graduate School. Her research focuses on the Belt and Road Initiative, global infrastructure, international development, and program evaluation. She holds a Master's of Science degree in social anthropology from the University of Oxford and a BA degree in English from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Before working as a researcher at the RAND Corporation in the United States, she worked on the BRI International Cooperation and Policy Advisory in China from 2015-2017, and on public-private partnership at the International Labour Organization from 2014 to 2015. Dr. Chu, I invite you to step up and then present your research and its findings. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Tesfaye, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much for this opportunity to share my results from this workshop. So let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes.
Great. So let me put it to full screen mode. Yeah, so today, given that my expertise is on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is an infrastructure-led development initiative. So for this fellowship, what I focused on is a small portion of an ongoing book project that I'm working on, which tries to assess the impact of China-financed infrastructure megaprojects on countries in the global South. So what you see today is a small portion of some of the evolving thoughts that I have. So some reflect some broader trends, and some reflect some evidence from the ground. So the overall topic that I want to talk about today is, as infrastructure needs grow in the global South, a more equitable approach is needed. Before I get into infrastructure megaprojects, which is the focus of my research, I want to give you some context about China's as a leading infrastructure financier. And in this chart, we see some data from the center that I work for, which is the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. And it shows China's overseas development finance by year from 2008 to 2021. And we can see that between 2008 and 2016, overall, there has been a gradual growth in China's overseas development finance. It peaked in 2016 and has gone through an overall decline in terms of both the number of commitments and the number of committed amount. And And if we look at the data, we see actually in recent years, since the peak in 2016, in both infrastructure investment as well as in mega project investment, there has been a gradual shift towards from mega projects to small and beautiful projects. That is, projects that are smaller in scale of investment and that are more attentive to socioeconomic impacts. And I think that shows China's learning process from developing infrastructure mega projects. And whether this trend will keep evolving in future remains to be seen. And among all the Chinese overseas development finance, infrastructure, particularly mega projects, play a very important role. And infrastructure mega projects offer huge potentials for economic transformation. And maybe it would be helpful to clarify what I mean by mega projects. Mega projects are infrastructure projects that exceed $1 billion and account for 18% of the total number of Belt and Road Initiative projects and 56% of BRI investment, according to China's Chinese investment tracker. And for many developing countries, actually China remains the sole financier for mega projects. This is largely because these projects are very high in terms of their upfront investment, and they have rather unpredictable return on investment. And China is willing to offer patient capital to support these mega projects that address infrastructure gaps in many of the host countries. And deriving from China's own domestic development logic, infrastructure and mega project development in host countries also follow the logic of infrastructure-led development. That is, facility connectivity leads to industrial capacity growth, which in turn transform to structural transformation. Yeah, and on the right, you see some pictures of some example mega projects that China is developing, including railway, deep sea ports, and some emerging industrial parks, and some efforts in decarbonization and in integrating decarbonization with infrastructure development. And China offers new features that could potentially make infrastructure-led development more equitable. Why do I say this? For three reasons. The first reason is given how China cooperates. China takes a very pragmatic approach in its cooperation with host countries, and it negotiates on a case-by-case basis, and it's largely needs-driven. So it attends to the needs of these host countries in terms of infrastructure development. And second is because of its economic model. China largely leverages Chinese firms' comparative advantage in infrastructure development. And these firms have built lots of experience in infrastructure building over the years of competitive experience in China, and were very efficient in their implementation. And they are also relying a lot on their existing infrastructure, which helps host countries with their development. And through infrastructure building, China is able to resolve host countries' connectivity and infrastructure investment bottlenecks. And empirical evidence has also shown that infrastructure development in the short run has created lots of job opportunities for the local residents, and it has also promoted some downstream development in local businesses. And another important feature is the technological transfer. That is the learning from the local laborers from both project construction and the project operation process. And another feature that bears some potential for an equitable development pathway is the fact that Chinese infrastructure development in general has a lacks political strings, and overall these infrastructure are economic infrastructure that do not interfere with developing countries' development pathways. One thing to note is that potentials for equitable growth offered by the Chinese model does not necessarily equal to equal distribution of benefits. And in fact, based on my research, my dissertation research on the Belt and Road Initiative and the Kenyan Standard Gauge Railway, based on an original survey and interviews with 132 experts and 91 community residents across 5 cities and towns in Kenya. It is true that the SGR has created wide-ranging socioeconomic benefits, and including some of the benefits that I mentioned earlier, such as employment, technological transfer, and labor's learning and capacity building. But at the same time, the Kenyan SGR has created winners and losers in this process. And from a sectoral perspective, we saw, for example, we saw a decline in road transport and particularly road cargo transport since the introduction of the railway. And on the other hand, because of the surge in domestic tourists through the introduction of the SGR, there has been a rise in tourism. And in general, I also observed a trend, which may be a short-term trend of large businesses squeezing out smaller businesses, and the winners take all trend since the introduction of the Kenyan SGR. And so some of the trends among cities and towns basically aligns with the sectoral trends that we are observing. So there has been a rise and fall of cities and towns depending on the dominant sectors. So for example, a former road transportation hub may suffer from as the introduction of the SGR, whereas a tourist town.
Dr. Du, could you quickly conclude?
Yeah. And we saw that because of the rise and fall and the winners and losers, we see that an initial full-hearted welcome gradually transitioned to divided narratives about its developmental benefits. So to conclude, I find that it is very important to take a more balanced approach to infrastructure development. That is, to balance soft infrastructure with what we typically conceive as the Chinese model, that is hard infrastructure development. By soft infrastructure, I mean addressing last mile problem, including social infrastructure, and introducing more capacity building and monitoring and evaluation. And lastly, I just want to talk about what I've learned from this workshop. I learned tremendously from Professor Aaron Tesfaye from writing habit development and topic scoping, and he also kindly scheduled mentorship sessions and provide very detailed feedback on my writing. And he also shared his own book writing experience and even shared chapters with me, which I benefited tremendously. And in terms of the writing workshop, this it's a really great experience to learn from experienced op-ed writers and to learn the difference between academic writing and opinion writing. And I also benefited from the peer assessments as well as support on op-ed placement. And yeah, and that concludes my presentation. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu. I just have one question. I had two actually, but for the sake of time, I'll just be brief. In the 1960s, during the period of African independence, both multilateral and bilateral organizations were big in terms of building mega projects in Africa. And that soon became unpopular because it was not contributing in terms of technology transfer, and it was also displacing local communities and so forth and so on. So in two sentences, in what ways is Chinese infrastructure development in Africa different from the traditional bilateral institutions projects? And then I'll open it for others to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think the key difference is that the Chinese model is more efficient, both in terms of its implementation cycle, which aligns well with the political cycle in Africa, which requires rapid project implementation to meet some of the demands. And it's also efficient in a way that's possibly not entirely positive, in that the feasibility studies and evaluation process is very quick at this point. And that means that sometimes some of the issues may not be identified early on. So I think the efficiency is what host countries and African countries cherish compared with the World Bank model. But on the other hand, it also creates some potential issues.
Thank you. Thank you. I will allow for one or two questions from the audience. Hello? Any questions from the audience? Okay, I think that there are none. Thank you, Dr. Chu. Our second speaker is Dr. Jocelyn Kene, and Dr. Jocelyn Kene will present her topic, how language holds back Chinese migrants' integration into African society. Dr. Kene earned her PhD in English linguistics from the Beirut International Graduate School of African Studies, University of Beirut, Germany. The title of her thesis was Language and Interaction in the Chinese Communities in Cameroon, a Social-Linguistic Profile. Her research interest includes Chinese in Africa, intercultural communication, language contacts, linguistic landscape, and field pragmatics. Welcome, Dr. Jocelyn. You have 10 minutes for your presentation, and we'll use the last 5 minutes. I'll do one question, and then maybe the audience will ask questions. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Tesfaye, for this nice introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Jocelyn Kene. As a linguist, I want to look at how language holds back Chinese migrants' integration into African society. I would like to start by saying a few words on Chinese immigration in Africa. There is an increasing presence of Chinese immigrants in Africa. In fact, according to Bodomo, there are around 2 million of Chinese migrants in Africa. There are two types of Chinese migrants in Africa. First of all, the so-called periodic or seasonal Chinese migrants, and the long-term Chinese migrants. The periodic Chinese migrants include those who are in the country on a short-term contract to work, for instance, in various construction public projects, in public hospital, at the Confucius Institute, and so on. Secondly, the long-term Chinese migrants, they intend to stay in the host country for an extended period of time. This latter group is growing at an impressive rate. It includes independent Chinese migrants who travel to undertake various economic activities in Africa, for instance, traders, or even the Chinese doctors who do the so-called TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. Focusing on Cameroon, Cabeston mentioned that there are around 50,000 Chinese immigrants in Cameroon. They are primarily economic migrants, and they work in several areas of activities. For instance, in the teaching area, in medicine, in agriculture, in the stores, in construction, and so on. Cameroon here is also an interesting case because of the interesting sociolinguistic profile it has. In fact, there are two official languages in Cameroon, French and English. French is spoken in 8 regions, and it can be seen on the part in yellow on the picture on your, I think it's your right, whereas English is spoken in 2 regions, the part in red. There are also around 300 local languages, a local, a lingua franca called Pidgin English, which is spoken throughout the country, a youth language called Franglais. Is actually a mixture of French, English, some Pidgin English words, German, Spanish, and also local languages. There is also Franco-Fulde, which is a mixture of French and Fulfulde spoken in the north part of the country. So the aim of my study is to analyze Chinese immigrants' language learning experience before they move to Africa. Here I'll focus on Cameroon. Chiswick and Miller maintain that the learning of the dominant language is a form of investment that can be made before migration. They maintained that the destination language proficiency is a form of human capital theory. This means that immigrants invest in the learning of the destination language or the host language or dominant language before migrating. This is to have certain benefits like the economic, political, or social assimilation. For instance, study found that destination language proficiency increase immigrants' level of self-reliance and stimulate the social participation and interaction. Similarly, it was found that immigrants' destination language skills has an impact on their economic outcomes. Therefore, many countries have looked at the role of languages in policies for the integration of adult migrants. In these countries, for instance, the learning of the dominant language is a requirement for obtaining a specific type of visa or for practicing certain professions. In Germany, for instance, where I am based, medical professions are regulated and migrants need to prove that they have at least a B2 level in German. A few studies also analyze interaction between Chinese immigrants and Africans. They maintain that there are certain linguistic difficulties in the interactions between the two groups. These difficulties are mainly due to Chinese immigrants' low proficiency in the destination languages. For my study, I used a mixed research method. Firstly, a questionnaire survey was written in French and was written in English and in Chinese, and it was distributed to 432 Chinese living in Yaoundé, Douala, and Bamenda. These are Cameroonian cities. I also conducted some semi-structured interviews with Chinese immigrants in several domains. Let me say a few words on the socio-demographic profile of the respondents. The age of my respondents ranged from 18 to 65 years old, the average age being 41 years. There were Chinese shopkeepers, but also Chinese doctors, lecturers, cooks, translators, businessmen, engineers, and so on. And they have been living in Cameroon from 1 to 38 years. Well, concerning the language learning experience of my respondents, it was found that no Chinese learned a Cameroonian national language before migrating. They did not learn any lingua franca, that is Pidgin English, Franglais, and so on. Concerning the Cameroonian official languages, as it can be seen on the table, very few learned either French or English before migrating to Cameroon. In fact, for those who learn either French or English, less than, or let's say 8% learn French for less than 6 months, whereas 11% of the respondents learn English for less than 6 months. Similarly, only 2% of the respondents learn French for less than 1 year, and 3% learn English for less than 1 year. At the same time, only 4% learn French for more than 1 year, and 8% learn English for more than 1 year. These respondents were mainly those who study either French or English as part of their studies at school in China. All right, Chinese also reported that they had not been requested to learn Cameroonian official or national language before migrating, or either to pass any language test before moving to Cameroon. And a Cameroonian, for instance, said that they want our money, but they do not want to learn our language. In fact, from the literature, information about the language requirements that Chinese people should fulfill before migrating to African countries is generally non-existent. This situation, of course, may limit the exchange of Chinese migrants with their local customers. It can also lead to miscommunication with the local community. From a previous study, it was found that the fact that the Chinese did not learn the language led to regular tensions. It leads to frustration with the local community. The low competence in the host community may also be a cause of their isolation. All right, pay little attention to the role of language in policies for the integration of Chinese migrants may, of course, lead to harm their integration in African countries. Therefore, here I recommend that Chinese and African government reflect on language policies, on Chinese seeking trade permits and residency in Africa. Similarly, to improve cross-cultural communication between Chinese and Africans, local and/or private initiative should be set up to encourage Chinese to learn the language of African countries, the official and the national languages before migrating to those countries. And lastly, it will be also interesting to look at how communication practices between the two groups, that is the Chinese and the local community, is carried out in various domains in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kene, for your wonderful presentation on Chinese acquisition of African languages, particularly in the Cameroon. And so really my one question is, and this is maybe for further research, you know, what, since it's the government of China that basically gives visas for migrants as they leave for Africa and other countries, it would be very interesting to inquire whether the Chinese government could carefully look at this and you know, make some kind of a policy, or whether migrants, particularly to Africa, is, you know, know or are learning or plan to learn the languages of those countries that they migrate to. But I agree with you. You know, for immigrants, for Chinese immigrants, language acquisition is very important if they want to integrate themselves in African societies. And that is basically my comment on that. Is there anybody from the audience want to ask Dr. Kene some questions on Chinese immigrants' language acquisition in Africa or the Cameroons? Okay.
I think there are some hands up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, please. Go ahead. Hands are up. Okay. Mic is free. Please go ahead. I don't hear anyone speaking.
Hello?
Yes, we hear you.
It's just a comment. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to comment on the number of Chinese people in Africa. Isn't there any updated statistics on the precise populations of Chinese people on African countries? I think the literature used 2012, 2014, 15 should be a little bit outdated, and I think it's a long time. A lot of things have happened that might have changed either way drastically positive or negatively on the population of Chinese migrants in Africa.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Is there another person who wants to comment on Chinese language acquisition in Africa? Okay, I don't see any. So we go to our third presenter. Our third presenter is Dr. Soji Oyernami. His topic is how the fourth industrial revolution can aid sustainable development in African cities, lessons from China. Dr. Oyernami is an early career academic who holds a doctorate from the University of South Africa since 2018 and was until September 2021 a lecturer at the Department of History and Diplomatic Studies, Olabisi Onabanjo University, Agbo, Iowa, Ogun State, Nigeria. He's currently an independent researcher and convener, China Africa Study Group, Ibadan, Nigeria. He has some local and international award fellowships to his credit, which includes the 2022 China in Africa, Africa in China / Africa, and Afro-Sino China International Relations Emerging Scholar Fellowships. And in 2021, Africa Research Grant from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, 2017, and African Studies Association Carnegie Fellowship, and includes several awards. And his research interests include environmental history, international diplomatic history, China-Africa relations, urban studies, peace, ethnic studies, democracy and development, leadership and entrepreneur and youth development. Welcome, Dr. Oyernami. The mic is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, sir. My presentation is into 5 sections. I'm sorry, I sent the presentation to ASCR yesterday because I will not be able to share the screen because I'm using a small mobile phone.
Okay. You have 10 minutes.
So the first part is the introduction of the, thank you for the sharing. So let's go to the introduction aspects. We all know that cities around the world are confronting a myriad of their environmental crises. Like currently what is going on in both Syria and Turkey. So my heart goes out to those countries, and may the Lord grant them power to withstand the tragedies. But noting the kinds of problems, environmental crises we are facing in Africa are so grave and so widespread in their consequences because of 2 things. Majorly, most African leaders don't consider sustainable development when they are planning for their economic development. Then secondly, the issue of widespread poverty across Africa. The statistics are available for us. For instance, when Paul Colliers described poorest bottom billion in the world, Africa features prominently. So because of this, despite the fact that Africa as a continent is contributing the least to environmental crisis, we are bearing the greatest consequences because of the unsustainability of the city management in most African cities. Some of the problems include unsustainable city development plans, inadequate urban environmental strategies, and the likes. And this study discovered that, well, the crises are enormous, but African cities are still redeemable. And the good news is that with the arrival of fourth industrial revolution, Africa is getting more opportunities in how to deal with this environmental crisis. So we look at now sustainable development and environmental crisis from a global perspective. The statistics here show that more than 47% of the world population that is around 2.9 billion people are living in urban centers, according to the United Nations Environment Program. And they projected that by 2030, the population will increase to about 4.9 billion people. That's about 60% of the world population. So, and the good news is that despite the increase in several environmental crises across the world now is standing together more than ever to seek solutions. And the greatest example here is the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015 by the United Nations that have been adopted by most of the member states. And at the heart of these deliberations is how to harness the opportunities being offered by the fourth industrial revolution for sustainable development around emerging cities, including those in Africa. Now let's go to the third. African cities and sustainable development. What can fourth industrial revolution achieve? Fundamentally, this study argues that cities, despite the crisis they're experiencing, they can still offer positive forces to ensure that there is social equality, cultural vitality, and economic prosperity and environmental sustainability across the world. But the crisis here is that most cities in sub-Saharan Africa have not really been benefiting from all this. Indeed, most of them have become centers of disgrace and centers of filth. But like I mentioned earlier, the advent of fourth industrial revolution is offering new opportunities to African cities if they are properly annexed to reverse this ugly trend positively and achieve sustainable development. Several scholars have given us examples of the particular examples of fourth industrial revolution that can assist these cities, like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and biotechnology. And to some of them, all of them indeed agree that annexing the number 17 of Sustainable Development Goal, which is partnership to achieve Sustainable Development Goals, which is number 17 of the goals, is the only way through which Africa can tap from resources from all over the world to achieve sustainable development. And I discovered that most of the relationships that African countries are having with their traditional allies are not really yielding positive results. That's why China offers better opportunities to do this. And the fourth point is to draw out what exactly can China's intervention achieve in African cities to achieve towards sustainable development. With the new renewed commitments of China to ecological civilization, which is entrenched in the beautiful China initiative, offered a great opportunity for Africa to really try to include the achieving greener economy in their bid to achieve economic development, tapping directly from what China has to offer. And the first thing we argue here is that since mass poverty, widespread poverty has been identified as one of the greatest obstacles to achievement of sustainable development anywhere in the world, especially in Africa. The first thing Africa can do is to deliberately learning from China how the country was able to lift more than 700 million people of its people out of poverty, absolute poverty. And I have a number of discoveries here. The first thing is, since most African economies still remain agrarian, I believe the biotechnologies component of fourth industrial revolution offers a great comparative advantage for Africa to learn from China in the bid to tackle poverty on the continent. Industrial biotechnology is the best way for them to learn from China on how to do this. And specifically, goal number 1, ending extreme poverty; 2, ending hunger and achieve food security are examples of goals that through relationship with China, Africa can really achieve, and to sustain their cities too. Other industrial technologies embedded in fourth industrial revolution includes artificial intelligence, that is using computers that can think like humans for monitoring and control, because this is control and enforcing of environmental laws has been one of the greatest problems many African cities are facing. To save time, I will go straight to the issue of combining education that will ensure attitudinal changes in Africa towards gestioning their cultural practices that are inimical to environmental sustainability. To conclude, over the years that China has been relating with Africa, it has been a very great positive influence on Africa through soft power diplomacy and economic engagements. But this study is arguing that deliberate investment in green economy in Africa should also be entrenched so that we can achieve sustainable development in our cities. But obviously, technology can never substitute for good governance or find solutions to myriads of crises we are facing. Therefore, governments across Africa must continue to commit to institutional reforms and consider sustainable growth as part of their main goals to achieve economic development. And Africa can learn and receive Chinese technical assistance and investments in combination with the existing models. Through this, they can initiate adequate urban environmental management in order to achieve sustainable development. Therefore, China cannot replace African leaders to achieve sustainable development. Instead, I believe that the governments across Africa should continue to create policies, conditions that are positive, that are conducive to achieving sustainable development in African cities, just as China is doing in Chinese cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Oernami, for your wonderful presentation, how the fourth industrial revolution can aid sustainable development in African cities, lessons from China. I mean, just a couple of questions that I have is, in your paper, African cities are in a crisis, 422 million live in poverty, and this represents more than 70% of the world's poor. And you also label the African city as a parasitic city, and so forth. So in what sense is the African city a parasitic city? Are you claiming that African cities are basically centers of consumption and that they don't produce anything to the GDP?
Okay, should I respond to that as you wait for others?
I didn't get that, I'm sorry.
Should I respond to that or I should wait for others?
Okay. Anyone has a question for Dr. Oernami on African cities, sustainable development, and how African cities can take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution? He mentions African cities can benefit from biotech industry, bioeconomy, and the digital revolution. What will it take for African cities or African leaders actually to partake in the coming fourth industrial revolution? Anyone in the audience? Okay, no questions. Then I'm going to move to our fourth panelist, Dr. Ivy Ye, and her topic is why education aid does not bring self-reliant development in Africa. Dr. Ye is a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of International Affairs, the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Shenzhen, China. She was a visiting scholar at the College of Development Studies at Sava University in 2019 and 2020. She received her PhD from the University of Hong Kong. She holds a master's degree in international affairs from Nanyang Technological University, Singapore, and an LLB in international politics from Sun Yat-sen University, China. Her research focuses on China-Africa relations, international development, critical IR theories, and further knowledge production. Her work has been published in journal articles, book chapters, and policy papers. Her recent book, China's Education Aid to Africa, Fragmented Soft Power, is forthcoming by the Routledge Press. Welcome, Dr. Yi, your microphone.
I'm going to share my screen. Wait a moment. Oh, my camera is not on. Thank you, Professor Tesfaye, for your kind introduction. And my policy paper aims to explore a paradox: why education aid does not bring about self-reliant development in Africa, and tries to propose some policy recommendations to improve. First of all, I would like to explain why this is a valid paradox. Despite decades of aid, Africans' reliance on aid remains. As we can see here, in 1960, a net ODA received accounted for 2.2% of GNI in sub-Saharan Africa. And this figure has increased to 4% in 2020. ODA consists of a significant part of educational spending in many African countries. It even accounts for more than 25% of national educational spending in some African countries. If aid facilitates self-reliant development, aid dependency should decline or even vanish, but the reality is the opposite. Despite a positive influence on increasing access to education in Africa, the effectiveness and efficiency of education aid are low in terms of school completion rate, education quality, and educational spending. For example, the efficiency of educational spending in Africa remains the lowest in the world. This picture shows that from 2010 to 2018, Africa's efficiency score for primary and secondary education was 58% and 41% respectively, far behind Asia as the second largest region. The contribution of education to national development is also unsatisfactory. The efficiency of human capital, particularly in terms of the productivity of labor force in Africa, is much lower than in other developing countries. The mismatch between education and the labor market is quite common in many African countries, and the deficit of social equity makes education ineffective in resolving social conflicts in many cases. All this reflects that education aid does not bring about self-reliant development in Africa in terms of both educational development and education for national development. Existing research pay much attention on the effectiveness and efficiency of aid projects. However, this situation cannot be changed by merely improving the effectiveness and efficiency of aid projects, because education is both an outcome and means to national development. The feasibility and implementation of education aid in Africa are subject to the particular local conditions in African countries. Education aid to Africa reflects aid providers' assessment of demands and returns of investing in particular education levels based on their own development experience. African countries' agency is insufficient in this process. Therefore, I argue that this is the key reason why education aid does not bring about self-reliant development in Africa. I will elaborate on this argument in the following comparative study. Western countries have been the main force in education aid, either in bilateral or multilateral forms. In the recent 2 decades, China has increasingly been a notable education aid provider in Africa. Their priorities and approaches are quite different. Western education aid to Africa is primarily channeled through ODA, and that's ODA to education. As we can see from this figure, the priority of ODA to education shifts from primary shifts between basic and post-secondary education. And this black line is about basic education and the yellow line is about post-secondary education. In terms of the approach, Western aid providers spare efforts on capacity building of educational systems and higher education institutions in Africa. The priority and approach are shaped by the knowledge shifts in international development, which are dominated by the West. For post-secondary education, scholarship, training, and capacity building are preferred because the role of human capital in national development is valued. And the concept of underdevelopment also legitimates capacity building by creating national education systems for African countries. In the recent decade, the decline of higher education in ODA is influenced by neoliberalism, while the rise of higher education is affected by knowledge economy. As we discussed before, it shifts between basic education and post-secondary education. So it's not like a decline in trade. It shifts between the two sides. And for basic education, it's underpinned by the dual consideration of social equity and economic returns. From the social dimension, basic education is considered a human right, while from the economic dimension, it's influenced by the assessment of economic return. There are a lot of research from the World Bank that support the argument that if you invest more in basic education, the economic return is much higher. And both the dimensions are to some extent influenced by the mass education experiences of Western industrialized countries and the education for all movement. Capacity building is closely associated with the post-colonial development in Africa. After the independence, African countries are faced with the urgent problem of building up a wide range of national systems, including the educational systems and higher education institutions to develop themselves. And based on the superiority of education capacity, Western countries spare efforts on helping build educational systems and higher education institutions in African countries. This is like a natural process and a preference. By contrast, China focuses on higher end vocational education through scholarships and on-job training for managerial and technical people. As we can see here, China's scholarship and training opportunities promised in the forecast have increased rapidly from 2004 to 2021. And the Dakar Action Plan launched in 2021 further emphasized vocational education. The scope of vocational education here is much broader than training. By the way, I don't think that the Dakar Action Plan shows a decline in education aid. If you compare the number, it seems like a decline because it promised like 10,000 quotas for training. However, we cannot just judge it by numbers specified. Rather, we should pay attention to the unwritten information because the channels, areas, and sources for scholarship and training are much more diversified. For example, there are more scholarship and training provided by Chinese regional governments and non-state actors.
Dr. Ye, could we move to that towards the conclusion? Thank you.
Oh, sure. China's approach is like a historical continuation because it started at a point when Africa and China were at a similar starting point. And China's education aid is also featured as a dualism. It's duly conducted as education for economic growth and diplomacy. Also, this dualism is featured by the dual engagement of China's Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Education. Both of them have their divergent agendas to achieve. And this dualism is shaped by the development, domestic development in China, including domestic change in China and change of China's foreign policy as a response to the international domestic dynamics and also China's own development experiences. So, indeed, we should not completely deny the contribution of education aid providers. However, through this comparison, we can see that education aid to Africa reflects aid providers' assessment of demands and returns of investing in different levels of education based on their own development experience. This process is external rather than self-supporting. And self-reliant development implies a self-supporting development process. It should conform to national entities' cultural, spiritual, and social values. In terms of education, it should be rooted in African cultures and reflect indigenous knowledge and values. And therefore, I have 4 recommendations to improve education for self-reliant development in Africa. First, diversify the priorities in terms of education levels of education aid by country, according to the economic structures in specific African countries. Second, conduct regular field research on traditional, cultural, and social factors in education in African countries and incorporate them into education aid programs. And third, establish local teams consist of African people to design regular implementation and optimization plans for education aid in each African countries. And lastly, facilitate closer alignment between different aid providers to enhance the complementarity of education aid based on providers' comparative advantage to better address the diversified demands. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ye. We're almost out of time. I just have a question. What would two comments? Education aid from developing countries reflects experience of donors. You know, that's one thing I got out of this, and not the African experiences. And so I think there is some kind of a movement in Southern Africa to do the African experience-based education and so forth. I need to follow on that up. And the other thing that I got from your discussion is education aid, not China's, but education aid from the West reflects outside-in assessment. In other words, the benchmark is the education system in the West, and so the assessment is done based on that benchmark, and not does not reflect the inside demand for Africa. And so, that was an eye-opener for me, and this is something further research needs to be done on. But one thing you mentioned in your discussion was African countries provide the least in terms of education. It will spend the least in terms of education, and my comment on that is basically that is a reflection, even though I cannot generalize, that is the reflection of the fragility of the African state and institutions. The African state spends a lot of money on security and regime maintenance, and less on education. So it's a reflection of African institutions, and how do they, in the future, how will these institutions be stronger? Well, with economic growth, a strong middle class, these institutions in the future would be strong. But the question is, how do we bring about in Africa? I'm from Ethiopia. Change so that African institutions are stronger to deliver the political goods, and as well as the economic goods, education. I don't know if we have more time, the facilitator, I'm asking the facilitator, but if there are any questions, you're welcome. Please step up to the mic. Any questions to Dr. Ye?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity. My question goes to Dr. Ye. We have realized that a number of times Western countries provide education aid in the form of scholarships to African scholars. But on the other hand, sometimes these scholarships that are offered are actually a bait to lure African brains and talent to the Western countries, where they are rather utilized, rather than allowing these brains to go back to Africa to impart this education in their countries. What do you think can be done to change this scenario?
I would argue that this situation, it will take time. The key is about African countries, because China has a similar experience when we open the door and send our students to Western countries and they don't come back. It's natural, because it's natural that people want to have better conditions, better development for their individual development. But finally, if your country could maintain their the aspiration for better development to continuously improve yourself, then finally those people, they love their country, they will come back. And this is the experience of China. And initially, after 1978, when we opened the door, it's true that we spent a lot, but a lot of people don't come back. But gradually now there are more and more people coming back to China from Western countries. And I believe if African countries stick to the aspiration for development and stick to a comprehensive development of both economic development and social development, and eventually those people will come back to build their countries.
Thank
Okay,
you.
We
very
have
nice.
to. I have to say that we have to accept at the initial stage that people don't come back, and I don't think we should judge them. It's natural. It's human. It's human nature for better conditions.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, and then I'll turn over the microphone to Dr. Achipong or our Executive Director, Pamela Karslake.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Professor Tesfaye. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us for the Emerging Scholars Writing Workshop webinar. We are so grateful to you. We hope that you really enjoyed and you found this very
Mike is stuck.
foundation. Now, as part of ASCIR's vision, one of our goals is to train or enhance the capacity of African and Chinese scholars on Africa-China relations. And this is the first batch of emerging scholars writing workshops that we have done. This year, we are going to have another writing scholars workshop, and we hope that you will find this experience useful and would apply when the nominations are opened to join this incredible workshop and network of scholars. We are so grateful to you, and we wish you all the best. And you can go on our website, ascir.org, to check out the brilliant pieces that were written by these incredible scholars and professionals in their various fields. The center, together with the CAC and the Ford Foundation, would also want to thank our incredible senior research fellows, Professor Tesfaye and his team, Professor Bodomo, Dr. Unjala, and Dr. Jackie for the incredible work, Jacqueline for the incredible work that was done giving mentorship to our scholars, and for this incredible output that we are witnessing and seeing today. We wish you all the best, and we hope to see you in the next session. Thank you all. Have a good one. Back to you, Prof.
Okay, I don't have much to add. I think we had 4 emerging scholars, and I know one of them, at least a long distance and through email, Karen Chu, and I wish you the best, and particularly in completing your book, and I look forward to read it. And the rest of you also keep in touch. It was wonderful hearing your presentations and your work. And so as associates of this organization, I'm sure the executive director and Dr. Achipong will keep in touch with you. Thank you all, emerging scholars and guests, and of course, officials of the center, Afro-Sino Center for African-China Relations. And this concludes our get-together and the presentations. Thank you.